to introduce you to Professor Phil Hart, who's going to talk to you about saving the climate using maths. So welcome, Phil, and over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. Hi, everybody. As Helen said, my name's Phil. I work at Cranfield University, which is just near Bedford, and I lead a team who research climate change and how we're going to fix it. So I'm going to talk to you today about how we use maths in our work and hopefully how we save the planet using maths. Right. So first things first, right? Have a look at this picture. You see that little spinny thing? That is the planet Earth, right? And that's what we all live on. Right? We can't survive without a really, really thin layer of gas around the outside. And you see that glow, the glow on the edge there, that really thin glow is a thing called the atmosphere, right? And the atmosphere is full of invisible gases, and we can't see them, but we know they're there, right? And you can feel them. If you stand out in the wind, you can feel the wind on your face. If you swish your hands sort of in front of your face, backwards and forwards, you can feel that invisible stuff hitting your face, right? And it's stuff inside there that allows us to live, right? It's a thing called oxygen within there, right? Now, that climate spreads all the way around the globe, right? And that thing's called an atmosphere. But when we look more close to us, right, and we think about what's around us, right, in our town or in our country, then we call the little bit that's around us the climate, right? And the climate is what's happening to all of that gas that's surrounding the world, okay? So you can think about the climate being what clouds have we got? How hot is it? Is it raining? Is it clear skies? Is all that. So you can think of the climate as everything that's happening to you in the atmosphere, okay? All the wind and the rain and stuff like that, all right? Now, what we've discovered as scientists recently is that there's something really weird going on with the climate, right? It used to be that the climate stayed the same all the time. If you lived in a place, you'd get the same weather, you get the same amount of rain, it would be the same sort of temperatures and things like that. But what we've discovered is that it's changing, and that's really interesting, okay? Because if it's changing, what we want to know is, well, how is it going to change in the future? And is that going to be good for us, or might that be a bit difficult for us? Okay, so to try and understand what's going on with the climate, we have to use a lot of maths. All right, and what we're going to do is just talk about that for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. All right, so let's think about how we might know that the climate's changing, all right, and how we can use maths to predict what's going to happen in the future. All right, so to do that, what my team do and what I do is we look at what's going on now, okay, and we can do that by just going out and measuring what the weather's like, right? So that's nice and easy. But if we're trying to understand the future, we have to understand what happened in the past. So the more difficult thing we do is we have to try and figure out what was happening to the climate hundreds of years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or maybe 5,000 years ago, so that we can build a thing called a computer model, okay? So if we understand what's happening now and we understand what's happening in the past, what we can do is we can build a thing that will enable us to predict what's going to happen in the future, right? And all of that is built around maths, right? We couldn't do it unless we understood how to manipulate all of these numbers, right? So what we're going to do, we have to do 3 steps: understand what's happening now, understand what happened in the past, and then build something that allows us to figure out what might happen in the future. So the easiest one of those is to measure what's happening now, right? And we do that with really, really easy things. So we can do stuff like this, which is just a thermometer, right? And you've probably got one of those in your classroom now that tells you what the temperature is in your classroom. Well, we could put one of those outside and we could say, what is the temperature of England, or our part of England, or Scotland, or Wales, or wherever. Okay, so we can measure the temperature really easily. We can measure the rain by just putting a little rain gauge out there, which is just like a cup, and seeing how much it fills up every day. And if we're really smart, we can use some really fancy machines to go, what is how much of which type of invisible gas do we have in the atmosphere? And if we do that for maybe a few months or a few years, then we can have a really, really good idea about what is the climate doing now, right? So that's the easy bit. That's the really simple bit. The really challenging bit is, what was it doing 100 years ago or 500 years ago? And that's quite difficult, right? And to do that, what we have to do is try and find something that was there at the time. So something that's been around for a little while, right? So first thing I want you to do, see those 4 pictures there, just shouting out to your teachers, which one of those do you think, or maybe there's more than one, has been around for a really long time, right? Is it the super flashy car? Is it a tree? Is it my dog Tilly? Or is it ice that's been around, sort of on glaciers and at the poles? So just shout it out, and then just write in the chat which ones you think have been around for a really long time. So ice, trees, cool. Karen got it. Ice and trees, ice and trees. Hey, you guys are really smart. Okay, very cool. All right. So if we can find things that have been around for a really long time, maybe we can look at them and try and understand what the environment was like a long time ago. So let's think about trees just for the first time, right? Trees are super useful to me and my work, all right, and to my team's work, and to understanding what's going on in the climate a really long time ago. Because if you slice through a tree and look at it, you see tree rings, right? And every year that a tree grows, it gets a new ring on it, right? So if a tree is 5 years old, it will have 5 rings in. If it's 200 years old, it will have 200 rings in, right? And the really brilliant thing about that is a tree will grow more in a wet year than it will in a dry year. So if I measure them, what I can figure out is whether or not that year for that ring was a wet year or was a dry year, right? So what we as scientists do is we'll go out and we'll measure hundreds and thousands of trees, right? And try and compare how each tree grew over the last 1,000 years or so, something like that. And we start to use a bit of maths called averaging and statistics to try and make draw answers from that. So if we have 500 trees and we look 200 years ago, what was on average, did most trees grow quite a lot, or did they grow hardly at all, right? And we can use statistics to try and put together a picture of whether the year 1873 or any other year you might want to choose was wetter or drier than others. And then if we're really clever, we can apply some more advanced statistics, some maths, so a branch of maths called statistics, to say, well, okay, if a tree ring is 2 millimeters thick, how much rain do we think happened in that year? If it's 4 millimeters thick, how much rain do we think we could do? Right? And the great thing is, always we get bigger tree rings in wet years, and we get thinner tree rings in dry years. So that's like a way of looking back over time and saying how wet or dry was each one of those years, and we can use maths to help us to figure all that out. So question for you guys, right? Thinking about your birthday and the year you were born, right? Let's say me and my team, we go off and we chop down some trees and we look at tree rings and we look at the ring that corresponds to your year the year you were born, and it's a big, thick ring in there. Write in the chat, do you think that means it was a wet year, or do you think it means it was a dry year? You tell me. Write them in the chat, quick. See how clever you are. Oh, wet year. Claire going there first. Well done, Claire. Brilliant. Where's the year? And what about if we change that and say most of the tree rings are thin in that year? What does that tell us about how much rain there was? Is there lots of rain or not very much rain? Brilliant. You're all really cool. Right, you're all really cool. Okay. Now, the brilliant thing about that is we just looked back in the past and we said, how wet was the year that you were born in? Which is brilliant. But the brilliant thing is we can do that for any year we like. Right? We can look 20 years ago, we could look 200 years ago, we could look 2000 years ago, and we can use the maths of statistics to work out with really quite good accuracy how much rain fell in that year. So any particular year we want, we can say how wet it was. So that's kind of like looking back into the past before any of us were there, and being able to use maths to say how wet it was, which is an amazing thing. Right? There are other things that we can use, right? That are like that, right? So trees can tell us how wet it was. Just going around these pictures here. Somebody put in chat what they think the bottom picture is. Somebody type really quickly. Corals. Okay, so these are underwater objects. They're actually animals, right? But they grow in a similar type of way to a tree. And every year we can see how much they've grown through little rings that appear on it. Right? And we can use coral in exactly the same ways that we use trees. Looking at this picture up here with the bee on it, can anybody tell me what's that little yellow stuff that's all over the back of the bees? Somebody put it in chat. Pollen. You guys are much cleverer. Oh, okay, so that pollen, right? So bees flying around, go onto flowers, and the pollen sticks to their backs, and the plants use that to reproduce. Right now, if it's a wet year, a particular type of plant will grow much more than if it's a dry year. Some plants like it really dry, some like it really wet. Some plants like it really sunny and hot. Some like it sort of overcast and grey and a little bit damper. Right? So we can look at the type of pollen that is in the soils for any particular year and try and figure out from there whether or not it was hot or cold or wet or dry or whatever. What about this last picture, the one up in the top right hand corner? Right? Anyone tell me what they think we're doing there? Okay, now my boss is a big deal in this one. My boss goes out and drills into the ice in the polar regions, and he pulls out those tubes of ice. And ice is really cool because over time, an ice layer, you get ice, then you get snow on the top of it, and then you'll get more snow on the top of it, and it will crunch it down, and it will form ice, and it will gradually grow. So if we go down into ice cores, we can almost go back in time and say, okay, well, what's in there? What pollens have been trapped in that ice? What gases have been trapped in that ice? And we can tell from how much ice was laid down each year, how wet that year was and stuff. So the trick is, and this is what we do as scientists, where we go out and we measure all of these things. So we go out and we look at trees, and we look at corals, and we look at pollen, and we look at ice cores, and we look at soil sediments and stuff, and we put all of those into our sort of equations and things like that to work out not just how wet it was, but how hot it was, and what type of plants survived, and what was in the atmosphere and things like that. And when we do that, because we've got so many different things we're looking at, we can get a really, really good view of what the climate was like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and even further. even further back. And we do that by understanding that if, let's go back to trees, if a tree ring is this thick, then that means this much rain fell, right? And we're building things called, that's called a mathematical relationship, where we can say a certain thickness or a certain amount of rain will lead to a certain thickness of tree ring, right? That's a mathematical relationship that we've got. More rain, thicker tree rings. Certain amount more rain, a certain amount more thickness of tree rings. And those mathematical relationships from all of this stuff, from coral, from pollen, from icicles, from soil samples, from tree rings, or can, if we put them all together, that's when we can build a really, really accurate view of what's going on, right? So the question is, though, how do we put all of these things together to work out accurately what was going on? Well, what we do is we crunch all of those mathematical relationships together, right? All of those things, all of the things about tree rings, all of the things about pollen, or whatever. And to do that, we used some more advanced maths, right? But it's actually really simple, all right? What we do is we build a thing called a model, right? And a model is really simple, right? A model is just something that we can use to play with, to go, what happens if I do this? What happens if I push on that? What happens if I make it wetter? All right. So it's a tool, it's a playground for scientists or for mathematicians, right? But you can think of a model as, or a computer model or whatever, right? A model is exactly the same as if you were to have a model aeroplane, right? If we wanted to know what would happen if we made the wings on an aeroplane bigger, we can build a little model of an aeroplane and we can fly it, and then we can make the wings bigger and we can fly it again, and we can test which one of those was better, right? That's a thing called a physical model. It's like a real model. It's something that you can throw or push or set light to or whatever, right? With maths, we can do exactly the same thing in a computer, which is amazing, all right? So it is literally, as long as we know all of those mathematical relationships, the sort of how much rain for how thick a tree ring, as long as we know what those relationships are, we can sit down and we can program into a computer something that allows us to go, all right, what happens if, all right? And the computer models that you'll be most used to seeing are computer games, right? Computer games is just a model of a world, right? It's like a pretend world inside a computer. Well, as scientists, we just use exactly the same type of things, using exactly the same type of maths, but we use it for a different purpose, all right? So, okay, I'm gonna need your teachers to stand by at the screen, all right? And I'm going to show you how a computer model can predict the future, all right? So we've got Fred there, who's just thrown a ball, all right? What I want you to do is shout out to your teacher and get them to put their fingers on the screen. Where do you think that ball is going to end up next, all right? So there's the green ball just left, Eric, the ball thrower. Where's it going to end up next? Okay, everyone pointing. Okay, so it ended up there, all right? Now, where do you think it's going to end up next? All right, again, point on the screen, tell your teacher where to point. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, it ended up there. All right. Now, can you see that dotted line, that nice little curve? All right. That's sort of telling us where the ball has been up until now. Right. And you made some guesses as to where they might be. But look at that curve and then follow that curve past the end of it. Right? Where do you think it's going to end up next? You know now about the past. Where do you think it's going to end up? Everyone shout out, get your teachers to point at the screen. Okay, now we see more and more of the curve. All right. Where do you think it might end up next? Point. Now the big question, where do we think it's going to land? Okay, follow that curve around. Get your teacher to point at where it's going to land, and it landed there. All right. Now let's think about what we just did. Right. Eric threw the ball. it left him. Oh, hold on a second. That was just a test. We have it every time. That was great timing, wasn't it? Okay, so think about what we did. Eric threw the ball. We followed it for a little while, and then we said, okay, we know what this ball is doing. We can predict, we can guess at where it's going to be next. And as we got more and more data points, as we understood more and more about what that ball was doing, because we saw it on the screen, we were able to make better and better guesses about where it was going to end up. And that's exactly what a computer model does. Right? It just says what happened in the past, where is it now, and where do we think it's going to end up. So we can use maths, and we do use maths, right, to give us a inside a computer description of what that dotted line is, and that allows us to push forward. Now, how do we use that in climate? Well, in climate, obviously we can't build a new world and test things out. So we have to use computer models, and we build all these models and all these mathematical relationships and all of that stuff, right? And then we feed it with data. We say 200 years ago, the tree ring was this thick. 300 years ago, the coral grew by this much. 500 years ago, this type of pollen dominated. There was loads and loads of this type of flower around, right? And we feed all of that into the models, and out pops the answers that says 500 years ago it was this wet and it was this temperature and where, and 200 years ago it was this wet and it was this temperature and it was this, and we can go on all that way, right? And then we can use that just like we did in guessing where the ball was going to end up. We can use that and go, all right, what do we think is going to happen in 20 years or in 30 years time or in 40 years time, right? And what the models tell us, because we know about the past and we know about what's happening now, is we've been able to build a really, really good view of what might be happening or what might be about to happen in the future. And as you'll have seen on the telly, and loads of people talking about climate change and greenhouse gases and this COP26 thing that's been happening in Glasgow, what our models tell us at the moment is that the world's getting warmer, right? And look, that's a bit of a problem. It's something that we've got to fix, right? Because we can't let it get too hot, because it's going to get really uncomfortable for us to live in, right? But our maths models as well can be used to go, well, what do we need to change to stop it getting warmer, right? Because we know what makes it warmer, because we've just built this brilliant computer model, we can then go, okay, what do we need to reduce, right? And maths allows us to do that, right? It's without that, I guess the key to all of this is if we weren't able to use maths, if we couldn't go out and do measurements and establish or get all these mathematical relationships together and feed it into a computer model, we wouldn't even know that there was a problem, right? And if we didn't know there was a problem, we couldn't start to fix it. So maths has told us, firstly, that there is a problem, and it's told us how to fix it, right? Which is amazing when you think about it. That's just like sitting there feeding stuff into a computer, and it says you need to go to electric cars, you need to stop using gas to heat your homes. All of that by just going out and looking at tree rings and looking at the back of bees and digging up icicles and things like that. So in a really, 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 really real way, maths has told us there's a problem, and it is going to allow us to fix that problem and maybe save the planet along the way. Okay. Hopefully that was really interesting for you. Thank you for all your answers. Look, we're on there. Do you have any questions for me that you'd like to ask?
Wow, Phil, that was amazing. Really, really amazing. Thank you. Is everyone there blown away like I was? Because really, really interesting. Any questions that your children have that you'd like to write in the chat, please do that, and Phil will be able to answer them while he's here.
At least he hopes he will. What are greenhouse gases? Okay, so remember that the bit that I said, when you swish your hand in front of your face, you can feel the atmosphere, you can feel the gases in the atmosphere sort of pushing on your face. Well, all of those invisible gases, some of them are natural, so they come from plants and they come from algae and things like that, and some of them are gases that human beings have released. Okay, and it's releasing those gases that make the planet get hotter, right? So gases that come from human beings' activity, from our activity, and that warm the planet up, are called greenhouse gases. And there's carbon dioxide. You hear a lot about carbon when people are talking. There's also ones called methane, and there's also ones called nitrous oxides. Okay, and all of those are bad for the planet. So what we need to do in order to stop the planet heating up is stop releasing those greenhouse gases as quickly as we can. Okay, what's the biggest math model I have made? Whew. Okay, I guess the climate models are really big, but one of the ones that I did that was really interesting was I built a model of it was a Spanish galleon that left Havana in Cuba, and it was full of gold, and it sunk somewhere between leaving Havana and getting to Spain. And we knew what the weather was, and we knew how these Spanish galleons behaved. And I wrote a massive computer model that predicted where it sunk. But we didn't find the galleon there. So there you go. So computer models are not always right, but generally they are. Okay, let's pick another one here. How would you know what the weather was like pre-trees? Okay, so trees are obviously really useful sort of for a few thousand years. If we want to go back further, then we have to look at stuff like soil samples. So we can drill down into the earth and we can look at what the makeup of the soil was. We can do some really clever scientific stuff to understand what the atmosphere was like during that time. Ice cores can go back a few thousand years, which is really super useful. We can look at what type of vegetation was about, because that's all fossilized and well. We can look at the type of animals that were there. So if we go back a few 100,000 years on further, then generally animals might have been bigger. So we can say maybe the atmosphere had more oxygen in it and stuff like that. What we can do is we can always find something that's like a tree ring, but doesn't look like a tree. We can always find something that looks like a tree ring or like a coral or like a ice core or whatever, and we can go back literally thousands of years. What made climate change? How did it become such a big thing? Okay, I can only give you quite a long answer. So up until about 1750 or so, so that's 250 years ago. Up until about then, the way that human beings behaved was very, we all lived in the countryside, very few of us in the cities. We weren't very industrialized. We didn't have big factories and things like that. From about 250 years ago, we started to build factories and we started to sort of build bigger cities, and we started to use more, and we started to invent things like steam engines and cars and aeroplanes and all of that sort of stuff. And that was all brought about by being able to use coal or oil or gas. All of those are sort of heavy emitters. They pump out a lot of greenhouse gases, right? And it's those that are the problem, right? So up until 250 years ago or so, we were fine for the environment. From then onwards, we've been pumping stuff out that has slowly heated the planet up, right? And it's all to do with oil and gas and coal, really. Okay, does space travel contribute to climate change? Yes. Rockets use a lot of energy, to get from the ground up into space. Most of them use energy sources that will pump out carbon dioxide as they go up to. We are looking at alternatives to that, right, to try and make it so that space travel doesn't. But at the moment, yes, it pushes out a lot of greenhouse gases, but we don't often go into space. We don't put 500 rockets up a day and stuff like that. We maybe put one up a week. So while it's a bad contributor, it's not really that bad. Okay. If you are cutting down trees to measure climate, are you not affecting climate change? Yes, if we were to chop them down. What we actually do is we drill into them, right? And just like we did with an ice core, where we drill down and then we pull out that tube of ice, we can do exactly the same with the tree and just go in and pull out a sort of a tube of the tree from the side, and then we can plug that hole up, and then we don't have to kill the tree doing it. When did climate change become a big problem for the planet? Okay, so we've been slowly making things or making climate change up until about 1950 or so. It wasn't too much of a problem. We'd only affected it a little bit. Since then, what we're doing is we're making it worse, and we're making it worse quicker, right? Because there's more people, more industry, more people driving cars, bigger factories and things like that. So it's only really started to get sort of something that we should start to worry about since about 1960, 1970 or so. So about the time I was born. So it's all my fault, actually. So there you go. So, all right. How does climate change affect us? Right. So climate change at the moment means that we have more things like wildfires. So you see the fires in America and stuff like that. More floods. More often we get sort of quite bad storms and things like that. But it's not too bad, not at the moment. It just means occasionally we're getting more of that. The thing that we have to think about is if we carried on pumping all of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it's slowly going to get worse and worse and worse. So if we don't do anything about it, then we'll have even more storms and even more floods and even more wildfires, right? And we really don't want that, because that's going to make it quite difficult for us all, right? So what we have to do is we have to change, right? So that we can slowly stop putting those greenhouse gases into the climate, right? And then we'll be okay, right? What we can't do is just carry on pumping stuff out because it will just get worse and worse and worse. And it'll eventually be a really, really hard thing for us to do very well at all in, right? Because might be too hot for us, or too wet, or too many floods and stuff like that. So we've got, brilliant thing is, maths has told us it's a problem. Maths has told us how to fix it. We just got to fix it now. So there you go. All right.
I think we've got time for a couple more. We've just got we've got loads of questions in the chat.
Thank
you so much for your engagement with that. So is there time for a couple more? Have you got time for a couple more, Phil?
Yeah, we'll do a couple more. Has there been any other names for climate change? Yeah, I guess global warming is the big one. Right, it's exactly the same thing. Climate change and global warming is the same thing, just with a different name. There's some fancy words for it, like anthropological whatever, but we don't need to go there. Mostly it's climate change or global warming. If we know that climate change is happening, why aren't we doing more about it? That is a really good question, right? And it's something that we really need to sort out. So all of our leaders were up in Glasgow over the last couple of weeks trying to figure out what to do about it. And it's a really big problem, because every country, every individual person has to make some sort of change to what they do, right? So trying to convince everybody on the planet to make a change, and to maybe get a new car that's electric, or stop eating meat, or plant trees and things like that. Lots of us can do that. Lots of us can't do that. Right? Lots of us can only do a little bit of that. But if everybody does it, then we'll be okay. Right? But trying to convince everybody to do it is a little bit of a challenge. And that's why this COP26 thing that's been going on in Glasgow, that's why it's so difficult, because trying to get everybody to agree what to do is quite difficult.
There's a good question from one of the schools. Typically, has maths contributed to cause the climate change, as humans know and build things that pollute the environment? That's interesting.
Yeah. So has maths contributed directly? I guess if you wanted to, you could say, like, as we've got better at maths, we've invented better computers, and computers use electricity, and electricity is generated from, or some of it, from oil and gas and coal. So yes, you could say, like, our use of maths sort of hurts the planet in some way. But I think what we have to look at is how much harm does having all these computers do, and how much benefit does having all these computers bring, right? And I think if you looked at that, I think you would say that even if we didn't have computers and we didn't do maths, we wouldn't know there was a problem, and we'd end up with a really, really warm planet that we couldn't live on, right? So I think if you were to go, is it on balance better for us that we know about maths, or worse for us that we know about maths? I think it's clearly it's much better to know about a problem so that we can fix it. So I would come down squarely on maths is awesome. So there you go.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I agree with you. Maths is everywhere, isn't it?
It's just everywhere. You can't move without maths. Not when you get into the sort of working life and stuff like that. Do we want to do one or two more, or?
If we can just do one more, and then we'll have to say, I'm really sorry we couldn't answer all the questions, but they are they're really
all right,
engaged.
Let's pick one that says, okay, are aeroplanes bad for the environment? The answer to that is, at the moment, yes. Okay. If you take a plane journey and you got in a plane at London and you went to New York and you flew back to London later on that week, you would cause as much carbon emissions, so these greenhouse gases, you would squirt as much carbon emission into the atmosphere as running a car for a whole year. Okay, so if you do a lot of flying, then your impact on the planet is really getting quite severe. Right? So what we should all try and do is not fly too often. We all need holidays and stuff like that. We have to enjoy ourselves still, but we have to try and cut down our flying just a little bit. Now, what some of my workmates are doing are inventing new ways, new aircraft engines, and new fuels for the aircraft that mean they won't be bad for the planet. But that takes us a little while to develop that stuff. So in the future, aeroplanes will be absolutely fine. But at the moment, they do cause climate change. So we have to try and limit them as much as we can. Okay. I guess we'll
give that. Yeah, I think
we're out of time.
Yeah. Thank you all once again for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed the talk that Phil gave. I know I did. It's when I listen to any of these, I'm always blown away by how much I didn't know and what's out there, and and how much you've used maths in your job. And so thank you everyone again for joining us, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon. There's lots of thank yous coming in on the chat. So
yes, that's brilliant. Great. Thank you very much for listening. It's been really good to get all your questions and stuff. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about how I use maths.